Hello, everyone. It's King's Comments here again. And one of the questions that has come up recently, and I've been seeing it a lot on other people's commentaries, I don't know if it's been answered, is what does actual victory look like for each side? And I want to get into that specifically. But as it directly relates to the Ukrainian opportunities, I'm just going to be totally frank and say that Ukraine's opportunity has long passed for victory. The only concept of victory that exists for Ukraine and for the collective West is where Western Ukraine as a rump state exists without a seaport, meaning no more Odessa, and where that particular country holds out the hope of joining the European Union and joining NATO, which, to be honest with you, will never happen. But they're going to put out that sort of face. The collective West will say that they can claim some sort of victory, that Kiev actually won the war because they actually remained alive. But that's the only victory that exists right now for Ukraine, or the kind of semantic victory that you could cobble together for the collective West to actually think that they've actually won. Now, I believe that a great opportunity was missed at the outset of this, and not a lot of thought was given to how to fight Russia. And if you were a strategist, a military strategist, when this first started, the worst thing that you would have done was try to fight a conventional war against the Russians, knowing fully well that you weren't going to have any air power because NATO was never going to invoke Article 5, meaning that they were never going to get involved in a ground and pound battle with the Russians in the air and on the land. So knowing that there was never going to be air power, the whole concept of fighting against the Russians at the very outset was futile. So if you were going to fight this kind of war against the Russians, the best opportunity would have been to fight what I like to call guerrilla tactics. The same type of tactics that were employed in Vietnam by the Viet Cong, and the same type of tactics that were employed by the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Mujahideen when the Russians were in Afghanistan as well, which is you don't engage them in protracted battles on the battlefield because you're going to lose. But what you do is you make their stay or their protracted stay very expensive. And the problem with the Ukrainians is they never really thought out what they really should have done. So if you think about the 600,000 men that they've lost over the course of this war, I mean, many of those men could have actually been in eastern Ukraine harassing Russian supply lines, acting as civilians or what we call partisans. But this actually gets to the point of why I believe the Ukrainians were never going to win this war from the very outset, which is basically the eastern part of Ukraine is pro-Russian and always has been. And if you look at the elections that were held up until the point of the Maidan Revolution in 2014, pro-Russian leaders were typically elected because the majority of the parliamentary seats were based off of population located in eastern Ukraine. The majority of people in that area were pro-Russian. Now, they weren't necessarily wanting to be a part of Russia. They just wanted their cultural rights and their inherent rights respected. After the Maidan Revolution, we saw a degradation of those rights. And to be quite frank, we saw outright war waged from Western Ukraine against Eastern Ukrainians. Now, I've got this on good information because I have friends that actually, before the war, knew what was going on there. And one of the things I think that people just don't understand is that there is a racial difference between the Western Ukrainians and the Eastern Ukrainians. Eastern Ukrainians are typically pro-Russian, Russian-speaking. Western Ukrainians are culturally different. They sort of have a leaning to the West and always have been. In fact, during World War II, when the German army marched into Ukraine, they were received as liberators in Kiev. They were received as liberators in Lviv. In many of the parts of Western Ukraine, they were all received very well. It was not until they got into the eastern part of Ukraine where the Germans started experiencing partisan activities as they went and moved and rolled into Russia in 1941. Now, in terms of victory, I want to go back to what I said earlier, which is victory in Ukraine for the collective West is only one thing at present. And that is that the western part of Ukraine remain, and that whatever government exists there is pro-Western, and that they hold out the possibility of NATO membership, which I can tell you categorically will not happen. That's the only ability right now for saving face on the part of the collective West. Now let's just talk about the Russian side for a moment here. And I think there's a lot to be said for the mistakes that were made in February of 2022. And one of the largest mistakes that was made in February of 22 was this notion that the Russian commanders, or I believe a significant amount of the Russian commanders on the ground, made this decision that they wanted to take over the whole country. And you could see that in the way that they amassed tanks around Kiev and they were ready to siege it. They had basically overrun the country with minimal force, but they took it in such a way that the Ukrainian army was unprepared for basically what was about to hit them. And then they had to come back. And the reason for that was because Putin at the time had no interest in conquering the Ukraine. And I felt as well that he felt that he could negotiate with the West from a position of strength, which, to be quite frank, at the time, realistically didn't make sense, in my opinion. Looking at the way the West was handling the situation prior to that and the West's strong formation and dealings with the current regime post-Maidan revolution. So the Russian army pulled back, and they pulled back to the original status of the special military operation. So I want to make clear that there's a difference between a special military operation and a war. And again, that's a very, very, very different thing. So if you look at, for example, similarities, let's just talk about similarities. In Vietnam during the 60s, the United States had really no intention of eliminating North Vietnam per se. They weren't going to send 1 million men, boots on the ground, and take Hanoi. That was not the goal of the whole idea. It was a conflict. It was considered not a full-out war, but a conflict. And American boots that were there were specifically there to protect South Vietnam and ensure that they could degrade the North Vietnamese to the point where the North Vietnamese would never be interested in trying to reunify South Vietnam into one country. Of course, that all failed. And part of that reason why it failed was because of the fact that the inherent problem with the whole concept was that they mistook South Vietnam as a place where people were not patriots. And a lot of the people that ended up becoming patriots on the North Vietnamese side did so because of the atrocities that they saw the U.S. military doing as a function of the fact that the U.S. was engaged in what amounted to a war against civilians and a war against, I call them invisibles, meaning that they couldn't really tell who their enemy was at any given moment in time. And that's the toughest kind of war or toughest kind of combat to deal with, as we found out in Afghanistan, because 2 days after the Americans left, the government fell, which doesn't say much about the impact that the collective West had in the country in the first place. So, again, when we look at this concept of Russian victory, what does Russian victory look like? Well, I'm going to tell you what I think it looks like. The Russians have been able to, for the most part, conquer about 20 to 25% of Ukrainian territory, or what amounts to pro-Russian territory. I think that's something that we need to say more of, which is the pro-Russian side that actually voted prior to the Maidan Revolution for the leadership that was actually overthrown through a coup d'etat. That particular side never wanted to be part of Ukraine after all that happened. And so what the Russians did by coming in was that they made a decision that they needed to liberate those strongholds from the Ukrainian army. Now, if I was the Ukrainians at that moment in time, I probably would have melted my soldiers away into civilian garb and tried to create what I like to call a war in the rear, which is basically a war where you don't know where your enemy is. But after thinking about this in depth, I realized very quickly that the Russian populace in these regions didn't like the Ukrainians from the get-go. And so they would have been able to spot any resistance activities and eliminate them themselves, let alone having to deal with Russian military. So the paramilitary groups in these four regions are well liked. And I think there's something to be said for that, because it's their land. These are people that have been there for centuries. So from the Russian perspective right now, the special military operation is primarily an operation designed to get the occupiers off their land. And the only reason why this had to happen was because of the fact that they felt that the Ukrainian government, was basically trying to commit what amounts to genocide in Eastern Europe. So what you're looking at right now is a situation where the Russian military is systematically destroying Ukrainian forces on the ground in a conventional battle, very similar to World War II, limited scale, of course, in terms of the amount of soldiers in direct conflict, but brutal nonetheless. And what you're seeing is complete domination, superiority in the air, superiority in numbers. And as Scott Ritter mentioned, it's a function of math. So the Ukrainians are being decimated every day. And with that decimation, it becomes more and more and more difficult for them to see the light at the end of the tunnel. You could have all the military equipment you want, but if you don't have manpower or you don't have the technical ability to handle that, then you're pretty much finished. And what we're looking at here is the death throes of the Ukrainian army, which is completely separate from the Ukrainian regime. I think there's something to be said about that. We haven't seen the decimation of the Ukrainian regime. We've seen the decimation of the Ukrainian army. So, as it directly relates to what Russian victory looks like, Russian victory, at the end of the day, has very few limitations attached to it because they have all the cards. They're going to take over all of the four strongholds. That's number one. All of the four provinces and regions, which they've already done. They've absorbed them. They're probably going to end up at the Dnieper River and stop there. And I'll tell you why they'll stop there. The reason why is because they don't want to fight an insurgency war in the West, because that's what it's going to end up turning into, where the majority of Western Ukraine doesn't want Russians there. And Putin is very, very aware of this. The Russian military is very aware of this. So one of the things that you'll probably end up seeing is Russian efforts to destabilize their government, to destabilize their energy infrastructure, which is currently happening right now, and an attempt specifically to topple the government from within. And I think you're going to see more and more of that as more moles start to pair in the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian parliament. You're going to see these kinds of actions being taken to basically eliminate those that started this war in the first place. And again, you wouldn't put people on a wanted list unless you knew that you were going to get them after their term was over. And clearly the Russians know that who they're going to get and who they want. And those people are, in all likelihood, going to have to leave the country because nowhere will be safe for them. So Russian victory at the end of the day looks like that, in my opinion. They've made a stand, which is that Western Ukraine will never be allowed to be part of the NATO alliance. And I'm going to tell you what they're going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen. This will not be a war where the Russians go into Kiev and take Kiev. This is completely different. What they're going to do is they're going to tell the collective West that any attempt to put what's left of Ukraine into NATO or to position nuclear weapons on the Russian border through the western part of Ukraine will be met with nuclear force. Meaning that strategic nuclear weapons and the threat of use will be on the table. And I said this before, Ukraine is an existential threat to Russian security, and I think the collective West doesn't understand that the majority of wars over the course of Russian history have come through the Ukrainian steppes. And so they're going to make sure that Ukraine never, ever poses a threat to them. So once this war of attrition completely decimates the Ukrainian army and decimates a generation of Ukrainians, you're going to end up with a situation where the West is going to be faced with some horrible options. And that is that do they decide to see whether or not Putin is bluffing? And that's a dangerous game because Putin is not a bluffer. Any chance of putting troops on the ground or deploying nuclear weapons or putting Ukraine into NATO will be snuffed out because of the fact that many of the NATO nations are likely to say no. And the reason why they're likely to say no, even though they're probably going to be in the minority, is that within NATO there has to be unanimity about the use of, about making sure that a country or a member country or a new country can join. So you're going to see states like Hungary, Slovakia, you're going to see even Germany, because I expect Olaf Scholz to be not to be reelected. I also expect the new administration in the United States, which will replace Biden, I expect them to have a different stance on this. From my standpoint, the Americans have always viewed this as an opportunity to grow their industrial military complex and replenish old inventory and create new inventory. This is seen from the $61 billion aid package. I mean, let's be honest, much of that aid was already given to Ukraine. It was older weapons, older inventory. And what we're seeing is that the Pentagon now can go out and replenish those stocks. But I think there's a dangerous situation that's happening here. And I'm going to tell you the dangerous situation. What I'm seeing is corruption and graft in the U.S. military-industrial complex, meaning that $60 billion doesn't buy you what $60 billion should buy you. When you see a senator holding up a $90,000 bag of bolts, that sort of suggests that the military-industrial complex is gouging the Pentagon and the American taxpayers, which is the same sort of crime that the Russians now are clamping down within their own military industrial complex. So $60 billion in Russia in their military complex will buy them a lot more than what $60 billion in the United States is likely to buy them. And this, in my opinion, is going to create a profoundly different situation post-war in terms of military capabilities. Now, no one's saying that the United States as a nation will not be still the most powerful country on the face of the earth. But what is power? I mean, what is power really? Is power having the most warships, having the most airplanes? What is power? I think after this war is done, the Russians will be the most powerful nation in terms of military land power in the world. I don't see how anyone can actually suggest otherwise. And I'm going to make another comment, which is, if you were to replace Ukrainian soldiers with American soldiers on that same battlefield, the result would be exactly the same. And the reason is because, one, they don't know the battlefield. Two, they don't have enough professional soldiers. And three, in my opinion, they're more prone to run than the Ukrainians are. If you take a look at Ukraine in terms of its army prior to the decimation, the Ukrainian army, you could make the argument, was the second most professional army in all of Europe. More professional than France, more professional than any of the other countries, and larger. The only thing that Ukraine didn't have was armor, and they didn't have the ability to finance a protracted war, which is one of the reasons why I suggested from the very beginning that their only hope of winning was to create what is called a guerrilla war against the Russians and force the Russians to stay there and bait them into taking the entire Ukraine. That way you would have basically what amounts to a Soviet-style Afghanistan, forcing the Soviets or the Russians out at a later date once it got too expensive to continue fighting. But those opportunities have long since gone. And right now, all the cards are with Russia. I think if you listen to Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, many of the sane and sage voices in the room, Alexander Mercouris, Alex Christoforou, John Mersheimer, these are all people that understand realpolitik. They understand military matters, and they also understand that this is no longer a war that can be won. It's a war that has long been lost. And right now, I believe that the only path to victory for Western, or the collective West, is for them to claim that Western Ukraine still exists. And you could sort of see that in the context of what Lloyd Austin was saying in his congressional testimony, which is he was basically insinuating that Ukraine could actually win by sheer existence. Not meaning that they could win on the battlefield, because I think everybody is aware of the fact that they cannot win on the battlefield. But the fact that they can exist as a nation is going to be the central point of their narrative. Now, this narrative that Ukraine, or what's left of it, west of the Dnieper, is going to join NATO, that narrative is completely not going to happen. Now, if the West decides that they want to go down that nuclear road, then, to be honest with you, that's a situation where they're putting their own asses on the line, per se. And I frankly don't see any Western democracies wanting to do that. And even if you had 4 or 5 democracies wanting to do that within the European cartel of NATO, there will be some sanity, and there will be voices of sanity within the NATO alliance, which will eliminate any chances of Ukraine joining NATO at all. So victory, in my opinion, is exactly what I said earlier, which is all 4 provinces under the complete control of the Russian armed forces, Crimea stronger than ever, up to the Dnieper River, in my opinion, where the Russians will stop. And what they'll likely do at that point is completely eliminate what's left of the rump state of Ukraine's ability to exist with their current energy infrastructure. And it's going to be extremely difficult for them to do anything without continued support from the West. Russians don't care about that at all. As far as they're concerned, they'll stop the bombing and they'll stop everything once the West comes to their senses. And the West is probably going to come to their senses because at some point, many of these leaders that have been pounding the war drums are going to lose their jobs. And they're going to lose their jobs because their economies are failing. I mean, from a military perspective, the economic blowback to the West is criminal. I mean, when you look at what Germany was prior to the war and what they've become after the war, they've become basically what amounts to pretty much close to Spain, Italy, and all the other countries economically. They're no longer a powerhouse. France was never a powerhouse economically. So what you're looking at is you're looking at the demise of Europe in general. And I think what this does is it sounds the bell that Europe is no longer the dominant force with the United States together anymore. This will just cement what everybody has come to know as the Russian-Chinese New World Order. And that New World Order is not projected through aircraft carriers. It's not projected through military power. Even though they have the military power, and even though the Chinese are projected to have 20 carriers over the next 10 years, that's not how China projects its power. It's not how Russia projects its power. They project their power through trade, through security agreements. This is how power is projected. And in this new world, more countries are inclined to work with that kind of power than opposed to hegemonic power. And this is where the de-dollarization comes in, and this is where BRICS comes in to support some of the military battlefield accomplishments that the Russians have made in the Ukraine. Now, if the Americans want to test that theory in Taiwan, then they do it at their own peril because they simply don't have the manpower to be able to handle that kind of situation. So I don't want to sort of cross-pollinate issues, but victory for the Russians at the end of the day has always been the same. Whether or not the commanders understood it on the ground, and I believe the original Russian commanders did not understand what victory was, but today what you're seeing is you're seeing everybody on the same page. You're seeing Shoigu, Gerasimov, all on the same page. You're seeing them baiting the Ukrainians into counteroffensives, enveloping them in pockets, and decimating and destroying their armor and killing their soldiers. And they're doing it by ceding land when it's necessary to do so, and then encircling them when it's necessary to do so, and eliminating them as a fighting force. So I do want to say this. Russian victory at the end of the day is when the Russian armed forces completely decimates completely decimates the Ukrainian army. Once that happens, and we're very, very close at death's door for Ukraine, that's going to create a signature moment in the Ukrainian capital and in the capitals of the West. And it's at that point where I believe the real war begins. And that real war is, does the West decide to push the bear? Do they decide to poke the bear? Meaning that, do they decide to turn what's left of Ukraine into a NATO buffer where they can nuclearize it on Russia's doorstep? And that's simply not going to happen. So the sooner that the Western leaders, Western generals realize that, the better. I mean, I watch a lot of different videos, and I don't consider myself a Russian shill at all. I'm just looking at what I see on the battlefield, what I see on the ground, and I look at it from a completely pragmatic point of view. And what I'm seeing is complete, abject stupidity from generals or former generals that are parroting a line that is completely absent of reality. Like, I don't know what world they're living in to think that a military, conventional military, can win a war fighting the world's largest conventional army with one of the world's strongest air forces. How do you expect them to win? I mean, even if you had great armor and the Russians weren't able to destroy all that armor, there was no way you could replace the losses in manpower that exist in the Ukrainian armed forces at present. So I've sort of given everyone what victory looks like on each side. Clearly, the Ukrainians lost their opportunity for victory. I believe the Ukrainians only had one opportunity, and that was a guerrilla war, and a protracted one. But clearly they couldn't fight this guerrilla war because Eastern Ukraine was never interested in being a part of the entire Ukrainian state. And if it had been, it would have been very easy up till this point to harrow Russian supply lines. So, in conclusion, I do want to make sure that people understand that victory at the end of the day is a function of what you hope to accomplish. Excuse me. And I don't believe the West fully understood what their goals were when they decided to support Ukraine. I mean, what does victory look like for the Ukraine military or for the Ukraine country? What does that look like? If Ukraine believes that victory looks like reoccupying the lands that the Russians sit on currently, then they would have to resurrect, as I said, 600,000 dead men. And I mean Lazarus style. They would need to resurrect those men to retake it. And even then, their chances of doing so would fall just at the Surovikin line, not to mention what happens thereafter. So there's no chance of that. There's no chance of victory. So there's absolutely no way Ukraine can win this war. Absolutely no way. And the only way they continue to exist is if they make the decision to sue for peace, and they also make the decision to eliminate their current leaders and the Banderas that took over that country. And that's the only way, because if they don't, their demise is going to be internal, meaning that the people in Western Ukraine will turn on them. And you're starting to see that already. And that is what victory looks like. Thank you very much.